Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mesa College. Another opening, another artist lecture series. We're very pleased to welcome Barbara Magnus this evening. Actually, this show by her has been in the planning for several years. Several faculty people we've been thinking about having a show for Barbara Magnus for several years. And when Jeannie and I were asked to be guest curators for this particular show, it didn't take us too long to decide on Barbara Magnus. She's been working in LA making art for the past 30 years. And I invite you to look through her book in the gallery and look at her background in all of her shows. She actually, Jeannie and I were interested in her partly because of the book arts that she's been doing in the past 3 years, but she actually considers herself kind of a conceptual artist. She's very concerned with ideas. It's just instead of most conceptual artists end up not making a physical product, and Barbara does end up making very beautiful products using fibers and found objects and fabrics and things. So without further ado, Barbara will tell you all about it. Welcome, Barbara Magnus.
Water over there because I know I'll spill it. Thank you so much for coming and being here this evening and staying. Can you hear me? It's all okay. What you're looking at right now is one of. Is this better? Okay. What you're looking at right now is an etching. And this is part of the work that I was doing when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. Now, forward, okay. Another etching. I got to UCLA having grown up in San Bernardino, California. My parents came there from back east. My father grew up on a farm in Michigan. My mother was a Brooklyn girl. And I had a very, very strong connection to the land because my parents settled there because they loved the mountains, they loved the high desert. And they love growing things, and it's not easy to grow things in San Bernardino. Not nearly as easy as in San Diego. And so I grew up with a great appreciation of that. This is also work from my undergraduate years. And it's sewn paper bags, grocery bags, with some fabric at one end. And I had been making lots of drawings with marks, covered with marks, and I thought, well, why should I be working, on canvas? Maybe I could be using something else. And I had been using the grocery bags to print proofs for my etchings because it was a lot less expensive, and free paper, and so I started joining them, and at first it was with machine, and then the marks became stitches. Now, I had a great model in my growing up years of unorthodox solutions to problems, and that was my grandmother. She came to this country in 1904 from Vilna, Lithuania. As a teenager, she had been a spy against the Tsar there. And when she came here, her husband was drafted, and he came back from World War I with shell shock. So she had to be very resourceful. And I learned about unorthodox uses of materials from her. I learned a great deal about the mundane from her. For her, the mundane was the glue that kept things together when there were catastrophes. I learned a lot about language and that there was no limit on learning, no time limit on learning. I learned a great deal about compassion and social responsibility from her. She was a person who grew up without media. Watching television with her and seeing violence on TV would make her so distraught because she didn't see that. She didn't see the screen. It was real to her because she knew it firsthand. And she never quite followed the rules. So this was a big influence on me. As actually from the time I was 12 years old, I painted stage sets. And this initially started because I was roped into taking dancing lessons. Actually, I liked them. But my mother was looking for a solution to my pigeon toes. And it was dancing lessons. And so I started painting stage sets for the local dancing teacher and in school drama classes and for children's theater. And in all that time, all the way through high school, I had no supervision. You know, it actually just recently dawned on me that I had no supervision. I didn't know that I couldn't paint stage sets. I just painted them. So I learned a lot about taking license and just doing it. A little word about the dancing lessons. When I was taking them, and it was tap, mostly tap, and I liked the rhythm of it. And I'd start learning a step, and I would progress fine, and then one part of it would just not stick together or fall apart. And I'd master that, and then the rest of it would fall apart. And I realized, even then, that this was my learning process. I had to be clear on the whole concept. And that has been a very good model for me because it's made me very comfortable with it. You know, just knowing about that from an early age. And then the way that I describe how I do my work is a lot like a cow. And I digest things through 4 stomachs before it comes out. So things that are in the subconscious come out, and they're totally appropriate for the work, but they haven't necessarily been, intellectualized. That I can usually do later. I can usually, when I work, I tend not to talk about work when I'm doing it. I'm able to talk about it afterwards. I'll proceed with these sewn pieces. This was an early work that I did to get into graduate school. I had a 6-year hiatus between undergraduate and graduate school. I was trying to figure out how to make a living, and I started a plant business where I do maintenance and garden design and floral design. This is made out of palm fiber that I trim trees for, and it's sewn with cotton cord, and it's mounted on, or sewn into, I should say, canvas. This is probably the last use of canvas in my work. This piece is 11 feet by 4. So it's very much like a vegetable hide. This was graduate school. This is a piece called Gam, which is a conversation at sea, either between sailors or between whales. It's 2 layers of sewing. The first layer is on this diaphanous kind of party dress type material that is dyed and sewn with strips of silk and cotton tape. And then over that I've laid, it's like a cheesecloth type material, and sewed that down with thread. And the thread pulls that cheesecloth and there's into striations. So there's a couple systems of stitching going on here. The light streaks are happy accident. The pot was too small when I was dyeing the fabric. Now, that piece had kind of a contour to it, and I thought, well, I'm just going to really go with this contour business and make the work sculpture. GAM also had a very soft feel to it, like a baby's blanket, and I thought I really wanted to work with materials that were a little more cantankerous than that. This is palm fiber. It's sewn with copper wire. The stitches are interlocking, and this allows me to give the work a lot more sculptural form. And the construction is spiral, or in a plant material it would be like whorled. It's like the growth process. For us, it would be as if we were climbing a spiral staircase, and we see the same thing over and over again, but never see it in quite the same way. This piece is called Extrovert, which is like a gut turned out on itself. A detail. Another piece using palm fiber. This one is covered with handmade paper. Handmade paper is so very precious, and I wanted to address that. The paper is made from tissue thickness to almost like a cardboard kind of thickness, and it's covered with paint. The sewing punctures the paper, and you're still aware of that two-dimensional surface. So here you're in these pieces, there's always a sense that it was a two-dimensional surface translated into a three-dimensional object. Now this piece is in the gallery. This is called Metal, M-E-T-T-L-E, for what it took to make it. It's acoustical lead, which is rather thick. This was before I knew about lead foil. And it's sewn over palm fiber with milliner's wire. And it was originally set on a horizontal shelf, and there was a lot of wear and tear on the piece, so I decided to come up with a more happy solution, and I altered a clothing rack, which adds to the content of the piece. So it's like a carcass on a spit or a trophy. The metal, the lead, is almost like an armor, but it's only an armor in a psychological way. It's actually the wire and the palm fiber that keep the piece together. This piece is called Inner Tube. I had been doing these tubular pieces, and I thought, well, I really need to come to some kind of resolution with the ends. So I'm working in, even though it's a very organic type of work, it's also very formal. And so I join the ends, and basically it is like an inner tube. The piece probably weighs a pound, if that. But it has a very kind of lava, volcanic feel to it. This piece is called Impending. Impending is usually hung just a few inches off the floor. Gallery heights vary. So this is one way of having a consistent control over that. Impending is like a cross-section of inner tube, as if I just cut it in half. It's also, again, like a carcass. It's about, this is the reverse, or the other side. It's about control. It's has kind of an exploitation. I've used stitches in a very fanatical kind of way on this piece. And this is an early hanging that you're seeing here. Each time I hang this piece, I add all the debris of wire and hardware from each previous hanging, so eventually it will be hopefully quite encumbered. So from the circle, this is another view where the paint bleeds through. From the circle, I went to a couple triangular pieces. This is also in the exhibit here. This is called cant. Cant for the angle. Cant probably for being able to face the corner in a safe place. It's like a shelter. It's like a metaphor for a place, that shelter, and it's also, the skin. This is made out of rice paper sewn with wire, and I use Roplex for strengthening the paper. I always think of this as a counterpart of cant. This is called Lux. They're almost the same size, laid flat. It's like a cloak. It's like a galaxy. It's 2 layers of very thin paper, each painted black on one side and sewn with wire. And the whole idea with this piece was to pay attention to the holes that are formed by these sewing, and to not focus in on all the stitching. When you're working with very different and unusual materials, you run into a lot of problems with the materials being very seductive, and it's like red flags and flashing red lights all over the place. It's a difficulty that you really have to stay aware of, because otherwise the work can be just decorative, and you don't get into the content of the work. This was the original hanging of Azimuth. It was out into the room and tethered to the floor, and it was such a bear to hang. And when I took it down and untethered it, it was laying flat against the wall, and I really preferred that, so that's how I hung it in the gallery this time. This piece was begun in 1985. It was completed in 1997. I did not work on it the whole time. It was really, I think, the last of that period of the sewn pieces. My life changed dramatically in that time. I lost a very dear friend, and this piece was a place for reverie. I spent a great deal of time in the construction process of this piece, sitting on it, and I realized that it was like a horizon. So it's like a horizon as a metaphor for coping. And I use the calipers as measuring devices to help with that coping. This piece, Tracked Thule, is also in the exhibit. This is sort of a down and dirty studio photograph. It's made out of sausage casings, pork, and the center is beef. Beef sausage casings the beef gut is very fatty, and there's kind of a stench to it, and it's not nice stuff. And so I covered it with Roplex. Working with it's like aversion therapy for fat. You can't even stand low-fat milk in your, or non-fat milk in your coffee for weeks after this. Why gut? Gut for me is like where you really know things. It's not where you intellectualize things. And gut is for tract, the digestive tract. And thule is for that white island or white mountain that is mythical. It has not been disturbed. I was doing this piece while I was working for a client who was a developer, and he was carving up a section of the Santa Monica Mountains along Mulholland, and really trying to do as conscientious a job as possible, but still you can never take that land and put it back where it was. And so this was about that. And that's why I used the hemostats, which are surgical clamps, to hold it to the pipe. The pipe is like a symbol of, it's a symbol of progress. It's a symbol of all our material culture that we seem to need to accumulate, and it's so vitally linked with our survival. You know, it's just an inextricable link. So that's how I came about this piece. Mm-hmm. A nice fluid lecture here. This is why people say use 3x5 cards, but I can't even imagine. This is the reverse. This is an earlier piece called Freeze. It's actually a similar subject. You know, so I'm using archetype again. Freeze is like a one-world ocean, and it's again, you know, what are we doing with our environment? The stitches, it's not quite clear whether the stitches are repairing it or if they're coming apart. This is a piece using a lunar globe, and it's actually just Roplex and acrylic with a coating of paint that was on the lunar globe that I used as a form. It's called the Sea of Tranquility because that's the only name that didn't come off. Parse is in the exhibit. Parse is to break something down into its elements. It can also be to diagram a sentence. I consider this one of the beginnings of the bookwork. And the reason that I consider that it so is that it's like a phrase that's repeated with different intonation. It's about analogy. It's about order. Jung talks about language and verbal concepts being the stuff that our thoughts are made of. And I think that this piece talks about that same concept. So here I've used gut, I've used headlamp sockets. It has some of the very first of my use of the disc form. The disc is kind of like a tail that's spun out. In this case, the bottom one is a roll of putty. The top one is a roll of price tags that were smashed in a parking lot. So found objects, glorified. Value symbols is in the exhibit. A value symbol would be, in this case, a postage stamp. These are canceled U.S. flag stamps. It would be like our dollar bill. This is made, it's covered on both sides with stamps. The core of it is gut, and the color comes from ink. Ink is like potentiality. Muhammad linked ink to the scholars. He said for the scholars, it was like the blood of, to the scholars, ink was like the blood of the martyrs. The piece was, and I make this analogy because the piece was begun and came about after the Gulf War, and just thinking about what are we doing? What consequence is there to what we are doing? So the work is evolving towards kind of a very visceral and social and psychological content. I'm trying to talk about how we fit into the scheme of things, how we acknowledge or choose not to acknowledge, how we compartmentalize things, how we disassociate. I'm talking with this work about muteness and about longing and about fragility and worth and internal balance and coping. This piece was made possible with the help of a lot of people. I'm not a great correspondent. This is a kind of an enigmatic piece, but it also is the beginning of the book forms. I call it document. It's actually just two very shallow boxes, 11.5 inches high. The whole thing is 11.5 inches high, mounted on foam core. Now, foam core is a very sterile material, and I'm really very interested in addressing the content of materials. The box on the left is covered with parchment and is smudged with pencil. The box on the right is covered with gut and is filled with graphite. It's like the dissolution of words. So this is about getting lost in the cracks. This is about getting misfiled. This is about missing people. It's about all these things. This work is called Resource. It's I spent 6 months scrubbing Greater Los Angeles telephone books with ink, and it came about because my aunt is a social worker. Actually, I have lots of social workers in my family, and this particular aunt saw an exhibit of work, and it was environmentally related, and she said, well, what about people? And I thought, she's absolutely right. People are such a valuable resource, and we are ignored. So this is the piece that came about to talk about that. And what I did after scrubbing these with ink was I turned them so that they're in the same direction as voting registration rules. So you have more of a sense of the people that have been lost or fallen through the cracks. And, I mean, to me, clearly this piece was apropos because, just a few years later we had riots in Los Angeles. This little book is called Amnesia, and it was my mileage log. And I looked at this mileage log, and I thought, this is like the years just flew by, and I have to do something with this. So I covered it with wax and white shoe polish. This is called Duty Dharma. It's made out of tax envelopes. Another book from my life. Kind of life stories. This is called Byproduct. It's actually made from carbons that I used in my bookkeeping for my business. I'm very low tech, no computers. So, and I also tend not to see numbers. I don't remember numbers. They go out of my head. And so this kind of exemplifies how I don't deal with numbers very well. This is actually a very small book. Pages are 3 by 5. It's called Codex Avricia Hieroglyphica, which is the name of a bromeliad. The markings that you see are natural. I wanted to do something about how we read. So I organized, these leaves are actually long, strappy leaves. And I cut them, made them into pages, and then organized the pages and numbered them so that they would read across from left to right. Another arrangement of index, which is in the show. Also leaves that I have not changed the markings. I began this piece because I was working with these leaves, the Dracaena goldiana, in my cut flower work for my clients, and I noticed how beautifully they dried. They were so verdant and flora when they were green, and then so almost leather-like and animal-like when they were dry. And this idea combined with the idea of how we categorize things and how we need to know about things. It was almost like the idea of everything having its own fingerprint, and also the sense of needing to know where they are, where they fit into things. It's the same kind of thing as when you're driving down the street and you pass a person, and out of the corner of your eye, you see this person you don't realize, or you can't recognize whether or not they're male or female, and you somehow need to know this. And it's like, why? You'll never see this person again, but somehow we need to know this. What is that need to categorize? That's what this is about. This is blind faith. Blind Faith is a Samoan Bible, and I found this Bible. I thought, this is an amazing book. It's like one culture laid on another, and yet it's a Bible. And what is faith about? It's a very interior thing. So I stripped the type from this book, and actually was only able to strip one side of each page because the paper was so thin. Deacidified the paper, and so that it won't turn yellow and crumble, and then fused what text was remaining, those pages together, so that they're not available. They're only available from within. So you see ghosts of the text. And this is the text that I removed from that Bible. So it's actually just half of the text of the Bible. This piece is called Intermediary. So I've worked this into a basically concentric disc. The text is removed with tape, so this is tape. I have used some gut. There's just a little bit of gut in here, but it really made a difference in the piece. The text of the Bible, the shape of the disc like a story wound, and the drum are all intermediaries between man and the heavens. The drum itself is a vehicle. I was asked to exhibit this piece once without the cover on it, and I declined because it changed the entire content. It made the drum a container. Yes, it is a container, but it is more than that. Psalm is a French psalm book that I've stripped. I came to this piece, actually I had been doing some personal work with canted prayer, and this psalm is from the word to feel, and that's where I feel this is where I think prayer comes from, and I think that's especially where a sung prayer comes from. So this is the piece that evolved from that experience. And this is the text that was removed. I've used wax here. In intermediary, I used Roplex, which is an acrylic medium. I thought, what is the significance of all of this Roplex? Because there was a lot of it, and that piece actually required a great deal of mindfulness doing it. I realized that glue is perseverance. This is a more recent piece. It's called Bible for a New World. This is actually from one book. It was 1897 German-English dictionary that my grandfather used when he came to this country. He spoke some German, but more Yiddish. But as an immigrant, he used what he had. And the book fell apart, which is how I ended up with two stacks. And it's like turning your back on one language and what that means to take on the language of a new world. And for American Jews that speak Yiddish, that's never an easy thing to do, because Yiddish is such a very colorful language and so very descriptive that it's very hard to let go of such richness. It's the ultimate dog-eared book. I have to say it's also about, assimilation. This is the installation that we have. And actually, these slides are more brightly lighted than the original installation was. The lighting in the installation that you see in the exhibit is more accurate. The problem was being able to photograph it. So that's why we have a brighter room. The installation is called Acknowledging a Room of Ciphers. It came about when I was thinking about acknowledging, and all these window envelopes that bills come in, and all these envelopes that announcements for art exhibits come in, they're all like begging for you to respond to them. And they all want acknowledgement. And I thought, well, these envelopes would be a great metaphor for acknowledgement. So I started collecting them, and I started collecting them in early 1990s. But I didn't know what the piece would be. I just had a sense that I would need a lot of them. And so I kept this in mind, and I thought more about acknowledgement. And I thought, well, acknowledgement is really like the missing link in our communication. We talk past each other. We don't even hear what we say half of the time. We leapfrog over what another person is saying just so we can get in our 2 cents. But we're not tracking what the other person is. This is often the case. We're not tracking what the other person is saying. We're not with them. We're not even really empathizing with what they have to say because we have our point to make. So this is about this weakness in our communication, which to me is, even with all our technological advances, to me this is the frontier. So this particular room with its envelopes is about a finding a place where we can acknowledge where we are so we can move on and grow. You have to reorient, recenter to do that work. And how do we do that? So this is about processing. So I've taken forms that have been growth forms, and I've changed the perspective of the work to what really happens within the individual and how the individual processes things. I knew when I began this work, so I had the envelopes, but I didn't have much more except the idea of acknowledgement that I wanted to address. And then Barbara Drecker, an artist in Los Angeles who works also with books, not always with books. She has a small alternative gallery called The Living Room, and she asked me if I would like to use her exhibition space. And it has this wonderful little fireplace, and I thought, oh yes, definitely. And I know what work's going to be there. But I knew I wanted it to be the acknowledgement installation. And then with the fireplace, I knew that I really had to address the room as a room. So it would need furniture. And I wanted it to be very intimate because this room needed to be like a sanctuary, and it needed to be like a workroom. I think one of my models was the idea of Margaret Mead's longtime office in the attic of the Smithsonian. I think that was one of my. I mean, it's like a fantasy. So that was a model for the room. I chose these very intimate dressers just to have a sense of an intimate place. So the work is like how we compartmentalize things and then how we access them. And I've used the yellowed paper and the yellowed books and books that you can't get to the titles of to express experience. And I've used all the maroon to express potentiality. You know, it's okay to file things, but what are they filed under? You know, it's like, this is the story of my life. It's like, I know I have that information somewhere, but where? A lot of these books on this lower shelf are, they're actually covered with paper, and then the paper has been painted maroon and then drawn on with crayon to look like leather. I'm using artifice a great deal in this work. I'm filing things and taking them out of a normal context by putting things in drawers, you know, files in frankly, it's my underwear drawer. You know, I'm actually using my own furniture in this piece. I'm living out of boxes now. And the artifice is, you know, the illusion. Things are not always what they seem to be. Now, there are 3 titles that are 3 titles only that are legible. Spirit and Matter, Vision as Authority, and The World as Intention. And these are clues to the piece. Letters that have been dealt with, bundled. There's a sense of the romance, of, you know, the thrall of romance in this piece. What is that? You know, how do we use that in our lives? You know, we get, it's a very seductive thing. On the table, on the desk, is a pale blue book, which was a late 19th or 18th century music book. The text has been stripped. These are all popular songs, quite mundane. The text has been stripped and it's stuffed in a portfolio that you can see on, like, leaning against the wall. The books above that are, one is a book about psychic experience and trying to quantify it. And it was, well, I don't have great things to say about that. The other book was this sort of literary adventures, not a very elevated book. It was about a con artist and all his little tales. Let's see if I can. This is one of the chapter titles, The Bliss of Ignorance. The other chapter title, Thoughts That Breathe and Words That Burn. These were probably the only words in the entire book that were at all elevated. Everything else was beyond mundane. It was lower than. So the work is, it's like, how do we transform the mundane into something that goes beyond that, and to address the potential of a transformative and kind of ecstatic experience that art can give us. That's what this is about. Here I have the text from that book in the violin case. So there's a cross-pollination that goes on. Literature doesn't necessarily come from other literature. Music doesn't necessarily come from music. This is a train fare book of coupons, and it's called Passage, and it's like the potential of life's journey. And the hat box contains the corners of the envelopes for all the stamps that made up value symbols. So this is it's like about moments, and it's, it has that nostalgia kind of thing, but it also has this valuing of work. The chair is stacked with would-be carbon paper. It's actually fax paper that's been painted, and actually I put it in the oven. And it's like to me, it's like the busyness that goes on in your life that prevents you from reflecting and self-reflection and seeing beyond just one level of things. Someone this evening suggested that the carbons were like things that had been salvaged from a fire. This is very interesting. She was connecting to the idea of remembrance. Here's the book about psychic experience quantified that I have altered. The titles. And this is a flask of orchid tissue cultures, which is like, it's like a microcosm of the room itself. It's rarefied ideas in a rarefied atmosphere. So I've gone kind of full circle in just a different sort of way with the growing process in this work. From a porosity that the stitches created to a kind of porosity that's required by the viewer. I think that I have found that when I make art, it's not really about what I have in my head, of what it's going to be. It's more about what I'm open to. I'll hang work like the two triangular works, Kant and Lux, are hung exactly the opposite of how I thought they would be hung. which is a little dicey if it's the day of the opening that you're trying to hang them. So there's a lot of faith that goes into work, and there's a lot of guts that go into work. In concluding this talk, I'd like to urge you. This is where I get to stand on my soapbox. And I know that because my work is enigmatic, people say, well, why do you do that? Why on earth would you spend so much time doing that? Not only are you doing that, but why, And I would really like to urge you as viewers and as people who can educate an audience to encourage people to ask why when they look at our work, why this works, why it makes them feel the way it feels, why did the artist do this, why did the artist do that. I think that that's really the key, and we all hold that key. And I thank you so much for sharing my work.